Few American presidents have burned themselves into the nation's memory, quite like Andrew Jackson. Soldier, duelist, populist, and president, his name still sparks admiration and controversy in equal measure. To his supporters, he was the hero of New Orleans, the man who stood for the common people. To his critics, he was a volatile force of will whose temper and ruthless policies left deep scars. But behind the public battles and political storms stood a quieter story. The story of family of love and loyalty, and of 3 children who carried the Jackson name after the gun smoke cleared. Andrew Jackson's household was unconventional. He and his beloved wife, Rachel Donelson Jackson, had no biological children. Instead, they opened their home, the Hermitage, to the sons of relatives and friends, raising 3 boys as their own. Each would grow up in the shadow of old Hickory, shaped by his iron discipline, his patriotism, and his unbending sense of duty. Their paths would diverge, one heir to the Hermitage, one soldier who fell in battle, and one whose bloodline carried the Jackson legacy into a new century. Tonight we count down from number 3 to number 1, the 3 sons of Andrew Jackson, and how each lived beneath the thunder of a man who defined an era. Number 3. Andrew Jackson Donelson. Andrew Jackson Donelson was not just the namesake of a president, he was the nephew protege, and for a time the political heir to the man called Old Hickory. Born in 1799 to Samuel Donelson and Mary Purnell, Andrew was only 5 years old when his father died. His Aunt Rachel and her husband, General Andrew Jackson, took him in and raised him as their own at the Hermitage in Tennessee. From the start, Jackson treated him less as a ward and more as the son. He never had molding him in discipline, intellect, and ambition. Educated at West Point, Donelson inherited both his uncle's intellect and his fierce sense of loyalty. He served as Jackson's private secretary during the Seminole Wars, and later during his presidency, acting as one of the few people who could temper the general's volcanic temper. Within the White House, Donelson's polished manners and education made him indispensable, while his connection to the president made him a figure of quiet power. He was not just an aide, he was family, and Jackson's confidence in him was absolute. In 1829, when the Jacksons entered the White House, Andrew Donelson and his young wife Emily moved in with them. Emily, the First Lady's niece, became the de facto hostess after Rachel Jackson's death. Her grace and intelligence softened the edges of her uncle's combative presidency, earning admiration in Washington society. For a brief moment, the Donelsons were at the center of American political life, a surrogate family at the heart of the Jacksonian era. But loyalty in politics is rarely permanent. After Jackson's presidency, Donelson's ambitions grew. He served as a diplomat to Texas during the Republic's brief independence and helped negotiate its annexation to the United States. Yet, in the turbulent political realignments of the 1840s and 1850s, his loyalties shifted. Once a Democrat like his uncle Donelson eventually became the vice presidential nominee of the American Know-Nothing Party in 1856, a nativist movement that stood in stark contrast to Jackson's populist vision. It was a decision that shocked those who saw him as the keeper of the Jacksonian flame. Andrew Jackson Donelson died in 1871 at the age of 72. His political legacy tangled between loyalty and reinvention. His career, marked by brilliance and contradiction, mirrored the very spirit of the age his uncle had dominated, passionate, divisive, and unpredictable. Though history often forgets his name, his hand once helped shape the power of a presidency that changed America forever. Number 2. Lyncoya Jackson. Among Andrew Jackson's 3 adopted sons, none carried a story more tragic or more revealing than Lyncoya. He was not a nephew or a blood relative, but a Creek Indian child discovered on a battlefield drenched in death. In 1813, during the Creek War, General Jackson's troops fought and slaughtered hundreds of Red Stick warriors at the Battle of Tallushatchee in Alabama. When the gunfire faded, Jackson found a small boy among the bodies, his mother dead beside him. The child, no more than a year old, was sobbing, covered in blood and dust. Against every convention of the time, Jackson ordered that the boy be taken to his tent, cleaned and fed. He called him Lyncoya. What began as an act of compassion soon became a lifelong bond. Jackson wrote to his wife Rachel, asking her to take the child in and raise him at the Hermitage. "He is a savage orphan," he wrote, "but I will rear him as my own." Rachel agreed, and Lyncoya grew up alongside Andrew and Emily Donelson, treated not as a servant, but as part of the household. By all accounts, Jackson loved him deeply, often calling him "my little Indian boy." Yet in the deeply divided world of early 19th century America, love could not erase the lines drawn by race and society. As Lyncoya grew older, he received the same education as Jackson's white relatives, studying reading, writing, and Christian doctrine. He showed a quiet intelligence and a gentle spirit. But the outside world was less forgiving. Visitors to the Hermitage were sometimes scandalized by the sight of an indigenous child sitting at Jackson's table. For a man who would later enforce the Indian Removal Act, Jackson's guardianship of Lyncoya remains one of history's strangest contradictions, a glimpse of humanity in a man often remembered for his harshness toward native peoples. Jackson had once hoped Lyncoya might attend West Point and become an army officer. But the Academy's rules and the nation's prejudice made that impossible. Instead, plans were made for him to learn a trade. Before those plans could take shape, tragedy struck. In 1828, when he was only 16, Lyncoya contracted tuberculosis. Despite every effort by the family's physicians, he died at the Hermitage, his short life ending quietly in the same home where he had once found refuge. Andrew Jackson was devastated. He buried the boy on the grounds of the Hermitage, marking the grave with tenderness and grief. He would later tell a friend, "I lost a son by nature and one by kindness." Lyncoya's story stands as a haunting paradox, the adopted son of the man who would one day displace thousands of Native Americans. His brief life revealed the complexity of Jackson himself, capable of fierce compassion and equally capable of cruelty. A man who could love an orphaned Creek child, yet sign laws that doomed countless others like him. Number 1. Andrew Jackson Jr. Andrew Jackson Jr. was born in 1808, the adopted son of Andrew and Rachel Jackson, and the only one formally recognized as their heir. The son of Rachel's brother, Severn Donelson, he entered the Hermitage as an infant and was raised entirely under the watchful, demanding eye of old Hickory. From the moment he could walk, Jackson Jr. was treated as both privilege and promise, the boy who would inherit the estate, the family name, and the burden of living up to a legend. Growing up at the Hermitage was a unique education. His childhood blended plantation discipline, Southern gentility, and his father's relentless emphasis on honor and self-control. Jackson adored him, though he expected obedience in return. He once wrote to a friend that the boy was quick of mind and sound of heart, yet he worried that Andrew Jr. lacked his father's iron will. For the general strength of character was the measure of a man, and he demanded it of his son. In 1831, Andrew Jr. married Sarah York, a young woman from a prominent Philadelphia family. The marriage was joyous and strategic, uniting the Southern planter tradition of the Jacksons with the refinement of Northern society. When Jackson became president, Sarah took on the role of White House hostess after Rachel's death, working alongside Emily Donelson to manage the nation's most scrutinized household. In her grace and diplomacy, Jackson saw echoes of the wife he had lost. The president often said that the sight of his son and daughter-in-law together gave him a taste of peace after war. After Jackson left office in 1837, Andrew Jr. took over management of the Hermitage. The estate was sprawling and ambitious, its operation dependent on enslaved labor and agricultural export. But Andrew Jr. lacked his father's financial acumen and discipline. By the 1840s, falling cotton prices and mounting debts began to erode the family's fortune. Worse, he proved overly trusting in his business dealings, allowing partners to manipulate him. The same generous nature his father admired would ultimately undo him. Despite his failures, Andrew Jr. remained devoted to preserving his father's legacy. He hosted visitors at the Hermitage, maintaining it as both a working plantation and a living monument to the general's memory. When Andrew Jackson died in 1845, it was Andrew Jr. who organized the funeral and oversaw the burial, a solemn task that marked his transition from son to custodian of history. Financial collapse eventually forced him to sell the Hermitage to the state of Tennessee in 1856. He and Sarah moved to Mississippi, where they lived out their later years, quietly far from the halls of power where his father's voice had once thundered. Andrew Jackson Jr. died in 1865, the same year the Civil War ended the war that had shattered the world his father had helped build. He left no sons to inherit the Jackson name, only the memory of a man who loved deeply but lived under a shadow too vast to escape. If Andrew Jackson's life was a monument to power, Andrew Jr.'s was a lesson in humility, the price of legacy when born into legend. The story of Andrew Jackson's three sons is a portrait of legacy shaped not by blood, but by belief, the lives of those drawn into the orbit of one of America's most forceful personalities. Each child reflected a different face of the man history calls Old Hickory. Andrew Jackson Donelson embodied intellect and ambition, serving as his uncle's confidant, aide, and eventual rival in the political world. Lyncoya, the orphaned Creek child, embodied compassion and contradiction, proof that even a man defined by war could be capable of tenderness, even as his policies crushed others like the son he once saved. And Andrew Jackson Jr., the chosen heir, carried the family name into a quieter, more uncertain age, burdened by expectation and humbled by loss. Together, their stories trace the paradox at the core of Andrew Jackson himself, a man both fierce and paternal, driven by duty, yet consumed by passion. The sons he raised mirrored the complexity of their father's America, a nation torn between loyalty and ambition, mercy and might progress, and the ghosts of its own making. By the time the Hermitage passed into history, the Jackson family line had thinned, but the echoes of its influence remained. The general's portrait still hangs there, eyes sharp, jaw set, a reminder of a man whose love could rescue a child from the battlefield and whose will could reshape a continent. His sons lived in that shadow, some finding greatness, others peace, and one finding neither. In the end, the legacy of Andrew Jackson's children is not one of triumph or tragedy alone, but of transformation, how those closest to power inherit both its glory and its burden. Through them, the legend of Old Hickory became something more human, more fragile, and ultimately more enduring.